Hey guys, tonight, we're going back to a time when summer never arrived. When snow fell in June, the skies turned a strange shade of red, and people across the world wondered if the sun had abandoned them for good. We'll uncover a forgotten year, 1816, when the world shivered, crops failed, and darkness crept across entire continents. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? It's always fascinating for me to know that you're here, with me, on this quiet, cozy night. Now, let's dim the lights, take a deep breath, and ease into this strange and haunting journey together. It began, as many strange years do, with something that did not happen. The sun, that old familiar lantern which rose each morning to warm the fields and scatter the chill of night, did not quite arrive as expected. It was there, of course. It still climbed above the distant tree line, still dragged shadows slowly across the floorboards, still crept its golden fingers along the edges of windows. But it had changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, in a way that unsettled those who lived close to the land, whose lives depended on the seasons unfolding in their usual rhythm. In early 1816, across Europe and North America, and in places scattered across the far reaches of the world, people began to speak, in quiet voices at first, about how strange the light seemed lately, how weak and tired the sun appeared, as though it no longer had the strength to lift winter from the earth and carry spring on its shoulders. There was no great announcement, no thunderclap in the sky, or writing in the clouds to herald the change. Instead, there was a creeping coolness that lingered longer than it should have, a biting breeze that whispered through leafless branches well into the weeks when buds ought to have appeared. March passed with a sullen chill, and April arrived, not with green shoots or birdsong, but with silence, a waiting that felt more like mourning than anticipation. The frost, which should have retreated into memory, remained stubborn and familiar, clinging to the earth like an old grudge, reluctant to loosen its grip. In towns and villages, farmers watched the skies, and muttered that something wasn't right, that the air had a heaviness to it, a weight that pressed down on crops and spirits alike. In places like Vermont and New Hampshire, where winters were already long and stern, the refusal of spring to fully arrive brought not just inconvenience, but worry that last year's stores might not stretch far enough, that the ground might not yield what was needed, that this might be the kind of season old folks sometimes spoke of, the kind remembered not for harvests but for hunger. And even farther afield, in parts of France, Switzerland and Germany, the peasants who tilled the land noticed the same sluggishness in the soil, the same reluctant thaw, the same dimness in the daytime that made noon feel like evening, and dusk feel like something deeper. The sun itself seemed changed. In drawings from the time, it is often described as red, or copper, or veiled, as if covered by a gauze curtain, or trapped behind smoked glass. Some wrote that it glowed rather than shone, that it had the dullness of embers rather than the brilliance of flame. At dawn and dusk, the sky sometimes flared with peculiar colors, purples, deep oranges, and strange shades of crimson that bled across the horizon like spilled paint. And while some admired these eerie hues for their beauty, others found them unsettling, unnatural, even apocalyptic. There were whispers among the deeply religious that these were signs of divine displeasure, that the heavens were reacting to sins of the earth, or perhaps preparing to roll up like a scroll, as the book of Revelation had warned. But most people didn't think in such grand terms. They noticed smaller things, how the snow lingered on the rooftops weeks longer than usual, how their breath hung in the air on mornings that should have been warm, how the buds on trees waited too long to open, and then, when they did, seemed fragile and uncertain. They watched the skies for birds that did not return, listened for bees that did not buzz, and wondered why even the animals moved more slowly than before. There was a silence to the world in those early months of 1816, a stillness that pressed itself into corners, that seemed to muffle laughter and music, that made footsteps echo in places where they never had. Even in cities, where the rhythms of nature were often masked by the noise and busyness of life, people noticed. There were reports of unusual fogs and heavy cloud cover that refused to lift, of days when the gas lamps were needed long before twilight, of windows that never quite let in enough light. Artists complained of poor illumination in their studios, of canvases painted under a constant grey. Writers described a heaviness of mood that settled over them like dust, making their pens sluggish, their minds slow to spark. Doctors, too, began to take note of an uptick in melancholia, in restlessness, in strange, persistent weariness that seemed to have no cause. The entire world, it seemed, was cloaked in a dimness that was more than just atmospheric. It was emotional, psychological, an ambient gloom that settled not only on landscapes but also on hearts. And as spring edged into summer, the change that had begun so quietly grew harder to ignore. In May, frost returned suddenly, killing off the tender shoots that had only just begun to stretch toward a hesitant sun. In parts of the northeastern United States, the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on ponds overnight, and farmers woke to find their fields glittering with a cruel layer of white. Sheep huddled close, cattle stood still in the pastures, and birds, those that had returned, fell silent again, and people, from the humblest rural families to the growing urban poor, began to ask questions no one could answer. Why is it so cold? Why has the sun grown weak? What is happening to the world? But of course, they did not know that far across the globe, in a part of the world many of them had never even heard of, a mountain had shattered the sky the year before. They did not know of Mount Tambora, or the rivers of fire and ash, or the plume of sulfuric smoke that had climbed miles into the upper atmosphere, and begun its slow, quiet drift around the globe. They could not have known that the dimming sun, the relentless chill, the strange red skies were not omens or punishments or acts of God, but rather the aftershocks of a volcanic eruption so vast it had blotted out the sky itself. And so, as June approached and the earth remained cold, as the sun continued to shine like a dying candle behind a curtain, the people of 1816 braced themselves for a season that would not come, a summer that would not be summer, and a year that would be remembered if remembered at all, as the year when the sun forgot to rise, and with the land still frozen beneath their feet, and uncertainty clouding every breath. They did not yet know that what lay ahead would not only challenge their crops and their comfort, but would begin to unravel the fragile threads of daily life itself, pulling entire communities into hunger, desperation, and a creeping dread that even the longest night might never end. And while the villagers in Vermont huddled beneath too many blankets in June, and the wheat farmers in northern France stared hopelessly at frost-bitten fields that should have been full of green promise, and mothers in the Scottish Highlands measured out dwindling flour with trembling hands, none of them could possibly have known that the chill in their bones and the dimness in their skies had been born on the other side of the world, birthed not from clouds or stars or omens, but from deep within the earth itself, in a place most would never see, and perhaps never even imagine. For the true beginning of the year without a summer did not lie in the frost-laced dawns of Europe or the June snowstorms of America, but rather in the roaring belly of a mountain in the Dutch East Indies, an island chain that would one day be called Indonesia, where in April of 1815 the earth had split open, the sky had torn wide, and the greatest volcanic eruption in recorded human history had unfolded in fire, fury, and silence. Mount Tambora, that sleeping giant on the remote island of Sambowa, had slumbered for centuries in relative quiet, its last significant outburst long forgotten by the generations that built their lives on its slopes. But deep within its ancient heart, pressure had been building, unseen and patient as molten rock pressed and shifted and churned. And then, without warning to those below, without prophecy or prelude, Tambora awakened, and when it did not simply grumble or weep fire. It exploded with a violence so total, so overwhelming, that it changed not only the landscape of the island, but the fabric of the sky above. It began on April 5th, 1815, with a sound like the roar of distant artillery, heard hundreds of miles away. Sailors at sea looked toward the horizon, and saw strange flashes, as though some great battle was taking place beyond the curve of the earth. But what followed on April 10th was something no ear had ever heard, and no eye had ever truly seen. A detonation so massive that it obliterated the upper third of the mountain, reducing it to ash and stone and incandescent fury. spewing molten rock and superheated gas in every direction, turning day into night on the island and surrounding seas, and killing tens of thousands of people in mere moments. The ground shook, the sea boiled, and villages were simply erased, buried under walls of pumice and searing flows of pyroclastic death that swept down the mountainside like liquid thunder. And yet, devastating as the local destruction was, it was not the fire that changed the world, nor the ash that blanketed nearby islands like a death shroud. It was what rose higher, higher than clouds, higher than storms, higher even than the birds dared to fly, that would linger long after the screams had died and the fires had gone out. For from Tambora's wounded heart rose a column of ash and sulfur so vast, so dense, so sustained, that it reached into the stratosphere, over 20 miles high, and once there it did not fall back to earth. Not quickly, not visibly, instead it spread, slowly, invisibly, indifferently. Dust, ash and sulfuric acid particles began to encircle the globe, borne on high-altitude winds that paid no heed to oceans or empires. These particles were too small to see, but they were enough to dim the sun's rays, to reflect sunlight back into space, to cool the earth not just for days or weeks, but for years. This was not a darkness one could chase away with candles, nor a storm one could wait out. It was a curtain drawn slowly across the sky, subtle, pale, and relentless. By the summer of 1815, skies in India were tinged with haze. By the fall, sunsets in Europe were being described as blood red, unnaturally vivid, and lasting far too long. By the winter, scientists in London and Paris noted strange temperature fluctuations and increased atmospheric gloom, but few connected it to anything more than local anomalies. The idea that a single eruption, so far away and unheard of, could cool the entire planet was not yet within the grasp of science or imagination. But nature had no need for human understanding. The veil was already in place, and beneath it, the earth began to cool. The snowpack lingered a little longer into spring. Rivers melted more slowly. The growing season crept forward like a reluctant traveler. And as the new year turned, as 1816 stumbled into being, the air held the cold breath of a distant mountain, a chill that whispered across fields and through cracks in wooden doors and under the collarbones of shivering children. No one had heard the eruption. No one had seen the ash cloud with their own eyes, but its presence was felt in every hungry stomach and failed harvest to come. Tambora's explosion had released more than 30 cubic miles of rock and ash, more than 4 times the material expelled by Krakatoa later in the century, and nearly 10 times that of Mount Pinatubo in 1991. It had sent 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, enough to scatter light and drop global temperatures by an estimated 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. It may not sound like much to a casual listener, but that tiny drop was enough to tip the balance, to disrupt ocean currents, shift rainfall patterns, and shorten the warm seasons on which millions of people depended for survival. And yet, as the ash circled and the skies dimmed, most people had no idea that the very source of their growing unease, their failed crops, and their biting winds had already come and gone, had already shaken the world, shattered villages, and killed tens of thousands in a land they might never find on a map. There were no telegraphs to carry the news, no satellite images to trace the plume, no international network of meteorologists to raise the alarm. There was only the slow, silent spread of a consequence no one could name, a ghostly fingerprint of fire left on the sky, waiting patiently to be noticed. And so, while Tambora cooled into a hollowed-out caldera, and the survivors of Tambora dug through ash to bury their dead, the rest of the world prepared, unknowingly, to face the true consequences. For as spring 1816 turned colder and stranger, and summer failed to bloom, and livestock perished in barren fields, the human toll of that far-off eruption had only just begun to unfold. The ash had made its way into the winds of Europe and the rain of North America, and with every passing week, the consequences grew more severe, until the skies themselves seemed to mourn, and the land forgot how to grow, and the people, bewildered and afraid, looked to the heavens for answers that would not come. And as the veil of volcanic winter drew tighter around the northern hemisphere, People began to wonder if the earth itself had turned against them, or if the warmth they had once taken for granted might never truly return. And so it drifted, quietly, invisibly, without thunder or trail or name. The ash, the vapor, the dust of a mountain no one had seen, now suspended high above the earth like the breath of some ancient god, exhaled into the heavens and forgotten by the time its work had truly begun. These particles, so impossibly small that no hand could hold them, had risen 20 miles into the upper atmosphere, and now moved with a slowness and persistence beyond human scale, carried on jet streams that no one yet understood, circling the planet like a veil drawn not in malice or haste, but in indifference, an unseen hand pulling dimness over the world, stitch by patient stitch, until the skies themselves seemed to forget how to be blue. And unlike the smoke of a chimney that settles and dissipates with a gust, this ash lingered, light as whispers, dry as memory, too high to wash away with rain, too fine to fall swiftly to the earth below, lingering instead, in that fragile boundary, where weather ends and cold silence begins. It was not the kind of dust you could sweep from a windowsill, nor the kind that darkens a coat or clings to boots after a long day on the road. This was finer than flour, drier than bone, composed not only of pulverized stone but of sulfur compounds and acidic aerosols, born in fire and carried into the sky with a force that defied imagination. Once there, these microscopic fragments began to dance with sunlight, not to glow or sparkle, but to scatter and steal, bending the light away from the earth, dimming the warmth that normally seeped into the soil each morning, and chased away the frost each spring. The light that did make it through felt colder somehow, as though passing through a prism of forgetfulness, and it reached the earth less as heat and more as pale illumination, like the light of the moon pretending to be the sun. And yet no one saw this dust, no one pointed skyward and said, "There, that is where the darkness comes from." No merchant in Milan, or fisherman in Maine, could see the film spread above them. No scholar in Paris or priest in Prague could trace the shadow stretching across hemispheres, but it was there, always there, day after day, scattering light by fractions, cooling the oceans by degrees, changing wind patterns by inches, until rivers flooded, and skies grew heavy with unnatural rain, or emptied themselves completely of moisture when it was most needed. And this delicate deadly dust, so easily ignored, so casually dismissed, was rewriting the weather one sunrise at a time. The Earth's climate, balanced so precariously on a tightrope of temperatures and currents and unseen flows, began to stumble. In some places, this meant endless rains, drumming on rooftops without pause, swelling rivers beyond their banks, soaking soil until it could no longer hold root or seed. In others, it meant droughts, where the air itself seemed to have lost interest in water, where clouds passed over without offering a single drop, where crops withered not from frost but from thirst. And everywhere there was the cold, not always sharp or violent, but persistent, gnawing, a slow erosion of warmth that made each month feel like a borrowed season from some other year entirely. The great winds that move between oceans and continents, that carry the pulse of the world across its surface, began to change direction. The monsoon season in India, which so many millions depended on for survival, came late and left early. In China, the skies turned stubborn and strange, with snow falling on summer rice fields and famine soon following. In the Caribbean, hurricanes shifted in path and rhythm. In South America, the Andes saw an unusual chill, affecting both animals and crops. The southern hemisphere did not escape entirely, though it was spared the worst, and even there the seasons wore unfamiliar clothes, as though the earth had forgotten its own wardrobe. But perhaps nowhere felt the change more keenly than the northern hemisphere, where the bulk of the ash had drifted, where cities and countrysides alike grew dim under a sky that never fully cleared, where the spring came late, the summer never arrived, and the autumn began too soon. In diaries kept by farmers and merchants, by school teachers and clergymen, there are recurring phrases: a strange chill, a sun that gives no heat, a harvest that will not grow. One woman in New York wrote of watching her breath each morning well into June. A farmer in Germany noted the color of his wheat turning pale and dry before it ever ripened. A clergyman in rural England described days when the air was still and dead, yet somehow cold enough to freeze the dew on the grass well past sunrise. And yet, even as these symptoms multiplied, even as food became scarcer and frost more common, few connected the dots. The idea that a mountain could erupt on a distant island and change the sky above Europe or North America or Russia seemed absurd, inconceivable. The eruption itself had gone mostly unnoticed in the newspapers of the West, buried beneath the noise of politics, war, and local matters. Tambora was a ghost even before its dust reached foreign shores, and the idea that such a ghost could stretch itself across oceans and continents, could slip unseen into every sunrise and nestle in every cloud, was a truth science had not yet taught, and that intuition would never dare to guess. The dust moved slowly, but it never stopped. By the end of 1815 it had already reached much of the globe, and by early 1816 it had settled into a semi-permanent presence, a gauze wrapped around the planet, thinning light, cooling hearts, changing the rules of what to expect from the sky. And this thin floating veil had no sound, no scent, no taste, no presence one could detect with fingers or tongue or nose. It was the quietest disaster in history, and perhaps the most far-reaching. A disaster not of fire or war or storm, but of silence and slow forgetting, a forgetfulness of warmth, of sun, of certainty. And as that dust continued its invisible journey around the globe, the world below it began to change, not all at once, not with a crash, but with a slow unraveling of familiar rhythms. Crops failed in patches, and then in waves. Rivers flooded at the wrong times. Flowers bloomed only to wither. Birds migrated in confusion or not at all. And all the while, the people looked skyward, and saw nothing but the same grey, the same tired light, the same sun trying to shine through an invisible curtain. It was a world still wrapped in routine, wheels still turned, markets still opened, prayers still rose, but something fundamental had shifted, and few yet knew how deep that shift would run. And so, under this strange veiled sky, the people prepared to plant once more, hoping that summer might arrive late, but still arrive all the same. They did not yet understand that their seeds would rot, their animals would weaken, and their tables would grow bare, not from their own failings, but from a dust they would never see, from a mountain they would never know, from a wind that whispered change in a language no one had yet learned to hear. And as the ploughs dug into soil still too cold, and as families counted jars and sacks and silently worried over what remained, the year that should have blossomed into summer would instead carry them deeper into darkness, deeper into hunger, and deeper into the slow, quiet unraveling of a world that no longer remembered how to grow. And so the world moved into what should have been spring, April folding into May, the sun climbing higher with each passing day, the calendar pages promising warmth, growth, and the awakening of life. But the earth itself did not seem to agree, did not seem ready, or willing, or able to follow that ancient rhythm it had once known so well. Across the rolling fields of Europe and the wide, open stretches of North America, the season that had always come, reliably, faithfully, with birdsong and bloom and soft rains, tapping against the roof, now arrived as something unfamiliar, something hesitant and stunted, as though it had forgotten how to be spring at all. In places where green should have pushed its way up through thawing soil, there was instead a fragile crust of frost, a ghost of winter refusing to retreat, its cold breath still lingering in the dawn air, its brittle silence wrapped around branches that should have been swelling with buds. The ground was wrong. It felt wrong beneath the feet of farmers who had known its moods all their lives, men and women who understood when to plough, when to seed, when to expect the first shoots to rise in answer to sun and rain. But this year, they stood uncertain beside their fields, tools in hand, eyes narrowed against a sun that gave only light, but not warmth, a pale, cold presence in a sky that remained dull even at noon. The soil was damp, yes, but too cold, too hard, too reluctant to receive the seeds being pressed into it with cautious hope. In many places, the first plantings failed completely, sprouts withered before they broke the surface, or else emerged pale and sickly, trembling under unexpected frosts that returned night after night. long past when they should have gone, and each morning brought new questions. Should we try again? Should we wait? Will this season ever truly begin? In towns and villages across England, France, Germany, and the American Northeast, the people watched the skies and listened for signs of the season's progress. But what they saw and heard offered only confusion. The birds too seemed puzzled, arriving late or not at all, their songs muted, their patterns disrupted. Swallows hovered uncertainly near barns but did not nest. Robins scratched at frozen ground in vain. Even the starlings, so dependable in their chaotic flocks, seemed fewer and quieter than before, and the trees, those ancient markers of the year's turning, stood still as sentinels caught in some kind of slumber, branches bare into May, or pushing out early leaves only to lose them days later to a sudden gust of cold. Orchards that should have blossomed with pink and white remained dull and skeletal, and when petals did appear, they were often burned brown by unexpected frost. Their sweet promise turned bitter almost overnight. In New England, snow fell in April, and again in May. Villages in Maine and Vermont woke to white-covered fields long after their winter woodpiles had burned low, long after the last mittens had been stored away, long after the calendar insisted it was time to begin again. They stared out from frosted windows at gardens that should have been planted, at fruit trees that should have been buzzing with bees, at hillsides still wrapped in the pale memory of December. And it wasn't just snow, it was the cold, persistent and bone-deep, the kind that crept through floorboards and lingered in bedsheets, the kind that made joints ache and firewood scarce. Mothers wrapped their children in shawls each morning, even as the sun climbed high overhead. Shopkeepers kept their doors shut tight, not just against wind but against a sense of unease that pressed in like fog. In the countryside of France, where vineyards waited for their first tender shoots and wheat fields had begun to be tilled, the delay in spring brought quiet panic. Farmers postponed sowing again and again, watching skies that never cleared, testing the earth with cautious fingers, praying for warmth that would not come. The rains, when they arrived, were cold and pounding, drenching fields and washing away the first desperate plantings. Streams overflowed their banks, turning furrows into muddy trenches. In Germany and Switzerland, entire valleys seemed suspended in grey, rivers sluggish and swollen, meadows blank, forests still silent. The buds, when they came, seemed half-hearted, easily crushed by hailstorms or turned black by another night of frost. And through it all the people waited, watched, whispered. They told themselves, perhaps next week, perhaps after the next full moon, perhaps it is only a passing phase. But as May turned toward June, and the first signs of summer should have arrived, the scent of blooming lilacs, the hum of bees, the warmth that loosens shoulders and fills streets with laughter, there was instead a deepening worry, unspoken but shared across fields and fences and borders. Markets saw fewer greens, chickens laid fewer eggs, milk soured more quickly in the cold, and the children, restless from being kept indoors through a winter that would not die, now grew pale and thin, their games more subdued, their parents more quiet at the dinner table. There was less to eat, there was less to look forward to, and what made it all so difficult, so quietly terrifying, was the simple fact that no one could explain it. There were no warnings, no stories in the newspaper that pointed to a cause, no sermons that gave clarity, only a deepening strangeness. Some blamed sunspots, others divine punishment. Some whispered about a long-forgotten prophecy, or the shifting of the earth, but most simply said what they felt, that something was wrong with the world, that it felt out of tune, like a familiar song played just slightly off-key, enough to disturb the heart even if the ear could not always name the fault. Still, they tried. Seeds were planted again and again, fires were stoked when they should not have been needed, livestock were kept close to the barns, fed from dwindling stores, markets opened, though fewer goods arrived, churches filled with prayers for warmth, for clarity, for something to return the world to its rightful path. But as the days passed and the cold held on, as spring refused to bloom, and summer stayed hidden beyond the grey horizon, it became harder and harder to believe that this was just a passing spell. And so, as the season bled away into what should have been warmth, the earth stood suspended, no longer winter, but not yet anything else. A season lost. A spring that never truly arrived. A silence where birdsong should have been. A frost where flowers should have grown. A hunger where hope once lived. And those who lived through it would carry the memory like a scar, not of a storm or a flood or a fire, but of something quieter, colder, and harder to name. A year that forgot how to begin. And just beyond the horizon as June approached, that missing spring would give way to something stranger still. A summer that would chill the skin, scatter snow across the soil, and deepen the fears that had only begun to take root. And so as spring had faded into something that resembled more a timid and uncertain pause than a true beginning of the warmer months, the people across the farmlands of New England, the forests of Quebec, and even the temperate ridges of upstate New York, braced themselves for what they assumed, what they desperately hoped, would be a gentler, kinder June. But instead of relief, they awoke to a world that betrayed their expectations with a cruel twist. For the morning light did not break through warm and golden, rather it revealed a sky once again heavy with grey, and beneath it, as they stepped outside in disbelief, a dusting of snow, not the tender flakes of winter's first promise, but cold, sharp grains that seemed to carry with them a message from the heavens. Summer would not be coming. June snow fell in parts of Vermont and Maine, covering young crops in thin white shrouds, as if mourning them, even before they had truly begun their lives. In Quebec, the rivers steamed faintly against the icy air, like breath from a beast unsettled by the unnatural chill. The fields, having once dared to stir with life during the brief hopeful warm spell in May, now stood silent again, frozen over, their furrows stiff and their seeds rotting beneath the surface. Farmers wandered into their fields that morning, with disbelief etched into their tired eyes, hands clutching at their coats as if to reassure themselves they were still on earth and not caught in some cruel dream. And it was not only the crops that suffered. Livestock, which had begun to shed their winter coats in late April, stood bewildered in the pastures, shivering violently beneath the returning frost. Sheep, their wool thinned by the false promise of spring, huddled together for warmth, and the low guttural cries of cows echoed through the morning mist, their breath visible and desperate. Chickens stopped laying, pigs rooted nervously in the hard icy soil, snorting in confusion. Horses, unaccustomed to such reversals of season, grew skittish, stamping and pacing in muddy stalls or cold meadows, as if seeking the warmth that had been stolen from them. Children wept as their pets perished. Families watched helplessly as weeks of hard labor were undone in a single night. A man in New Hampshire, it was later written in a trembling journal, awoke to find his wife kneeling beside the window, praying silently at the sight of white fields that should have been green. In that moment, she was not praying for warmth. She was praying for understanding. Farmers debated whether to sow again. Some, defiant in their despair, took up their plows once more and dug deep into frozen soil, their hands numb, their faces wind-burned. Others gave up entirely, stacking their broken tools in barns and walking away, unable to face another gamble with the weather. In places like Albany and Concord, agricultural societies issued cautious advice. "Sow again," they said, "for this cannot last." But even their words carried the brittle uncertainty of men, groping blindly through a fog of unprecedented nature. Markets trembled. Grain prices surged. In small towns, people who had rarely exchanged more than pleasantries began gathering in community halls and church pews to discuss what they now feared was not simply a strange year, but a punishment. Some whispered of omens, some spoke of judgment, others, more practical and more fearful, began hoarding. The price of oats in particular skyrocketed, not only because they fed people, but because they fed the horses, the vital lifeblood of transportation, of trade, of ploughing. And without oats, horses starved. And without horses, the very structure of daily life began to falter. Across the fields and forests, nature itself seemed confused. Birds returned, and left again, migrating in scattered confusion. Trees that had begun to bud suddenly dropped their leaves, or worse, retained the frost-bitten husks that had once promised green. Even the insects were out of rhythm, some emerging far too early, only to die quickly in the cold, others never appearing at all, leaving pollination undone, and entire ecosystems teetering in imbalance. And in the towns and homesteads nestled in the valleys and hills, nightly conversations turned darker. What if this wasn't just a season? What if this was the beginning of something worse? What if the sun was failing, or the earth had tilted forever? Men who had never paid attention to the sky before, now looked upward, with quiet dread. Women whispered to each other about the strange colors in the sunset, the deep reds, the violet edges, the unfamiliar halos that seemed to circle the dim sun, weak as it was behind a veil of haze. Newspapers, when they dared speak of it, offered little comfort. Reports came in from far-off places: snow in Virginia, frost in London, frozen lakes in June in Germany, dead cattle in Switzerland. The strangeness was not local, it was global, and no one seemed to have an answer. In church sermons, fire and brimstone returned to pulpits long silent. Ministers invoked ancient plagues and biblical prophecy. Farmers, previously stoic and grounded, listened with fresh ears, their faith now stirred by desperation. Others, skeptical of divine wrath, spoke instead of science, of weather patterns, and unknown changes in the heavens. But none had evidence. No one knew the true cause. The eruption of a distant mountain had gone almost unnoticed in the Western world, and so the true villain of this slow catastrophe remained hidden, even as its fingerprints were everywhere. And so June passed, not in warmth or sunlight, or the sweet relief of long days and gentle breezes, but in a chill that clung to everything. A silence in the trees, a stillness in the soil, a hunger in the eyes of cattle and men alike. And as July approached, there was no sign that mercy would come with it. The days remained dim, the crops were either dead or dying, the livestock grew weaker, the people too grew thinner, not just in body, but in spirit. And so, with the earth still shivering in its unexpected slumber, we move forward into a month that should have brought relief, but instead carried only more confusion, more hunger, and a deepening sense that something had broken in the natural order of things, something unseen, something vast, and something that perhaps could not be undone. And so, as the echoes of June's snow settled uneasily across the fields, and the withered sprigs of what should have been corn or barley began to shrivel under cold and unfeeling skies, the world stepped hesitantly into the heart of summer, though the season, in truth, had little heart to offer. July came not with golden sun rays, or lazy warmth spilling across green hills, but with a chill that clung to skin like wet linen, a damp, bone-deep cold that refused to yield no matter how brightly the calendar insisted that summer was now in full bloom. In towns scattered across the northeastern United States, in the misty valleys of England, and the highlands of Scotland, in the villages tucked into the Alps and the rolling countryside of France, there were hearths burning even as the midsummer days ticked by. Wood piles diminished as fast as hope did, and those with nothing but thin coats and thinner coin found themselves huddled in barns or under blankets, watching their breath mist in the air. Yes, in July. The days were short in feeling, for though the sun rose as it always had, it did not burn as it once did. The sky often remained overcast with a pale grey canopy that never quite broke, and when it did, it revealed not the warm amber light of midsummer, but a sickly filtered glow, as if the heavens themselves had grown weary and withdrawn behind a veil of fine ash and moisture. Fires were lit not for the cheer of the flame, but for the bitter necessity of survival. In taverns and cottages, people would mutter stories of the old winters, comparing this so-called summer to blizzards past, shaking their heads and saying they had never known such a thing as this. Wool merchants did surprisingly well. Seamstresses took on work they had not expected to see until autumn, and throughout all of it, there was an eerie quiet in the fields, where nothing seemed to grow, and even the insects seemed hesitant to stir. Livestock fared little better than the people who raised them, with grasses stunted or dead. Hay was in short supply, and those with too many animals and too little feed had to make grim decisions. There are quiet records in old diaries and parish letters of animals let loose to fend for themselves, or taken to market early and sold for a meagre coin, or simply not fed and left to waste away as tears fell silently in the straw. Chickens stopped laying, cows produced less milk, Horses shivered in their stalls, swishing their tails not at flies, for there were few but at the cold. Even bees, those tireless workers of summer's bounty, struggled to find flowering plants, and returned to their hives with little nectar to show for their efforts. And all the while, children watched from porches and barn doors, puzzled at the sight of mothers knitting thicker clothes instead of preparing berry preserves, at fathers chopping wood instead of building irrigation channels, at summer looking more like a long grey cousin of November. In cities, the mood was equally somber. Markets offered less produce than usual, and what little they had was often inexpensive or of poor quality: withered roots, bruised fruit, wilted greens. In London, food riots began to brew, with whispers in the alleys about the price of bread and the uselessness of money when nothing could be bought. In Geneva and Vienna, there were sermons preached about divine punishment and the end of days, with priests pointing skyward as if accusing heaven itself of betrayal. The poor grew poorer, the hungry grew desperate. The rich, though insulated from the worst of it, could not escape the unease. Gardens they once strolled through now yielded nothing. Fashion, once flamboyant and frilled in the warmer months, turned dour and functional again. Conversations over wine or tea turned from politics or art to the weather, and how even the roses had refused to bloom. All across the northern hemisphere, the summer months slipped by, not with the lazy pace of long afternoons or the buzzing joy of harvest preparation, but with a grinding, uncomfortable sense of waiting for what no one could quite say. In some places, people tried to celebrate as they normally would. There were July fairs and midsummer gatherings, but many ended early, or were cancelled altogether due to cold or rain or simply lack of food and cheer. Bonfires meant to warm hearts seemed instead to cast strange shadows on pale faces. Musicians who played in town squares found few who stayed to listen, and storytellers had trouble keeping attention when children were too cold to sit still. Even weddings and church services, usually full of seasonal joy, were muted, with more candles than flowers and more prayers than laughter. And while the world waited, confused and cold, the crops continued their quiet rebellion against the unnatural chill. Corn, once tall and proud by August, now barely crept above the knee in many places. Wheat fields were sparse, and what did grow often turned yellow too early. Potatoes, a staple in places like Ireland, suffered from blight made worse by cold and moisture, and farmers began to see the writing on the wall even before the first frost of autumn crept in ahead of schedule. No one knew why this was happening, not truly. There were guesses, of course. Some blamed shifting winds, others pointed to the sun, and a few whispered of distant volcanoes or divine fury. But all the theories in the world could not fill the barns or put fruit in the baskets, or warmth in the hearth without consequence. So passed the summer that wasn't. A season of coats and cloaks, of dwindling food and dwindling faith, of cloudy skies, and even cloudier futures. And as August dwindled into September, the farmers, bakers, and mothers of the world turned their eyes anxiously toward autumn, not because they were ready to embrace the cooler days, but because they feared the frost that would come too soon, the harvest that would not come at all, and the winter that already seemed to be knocking at the door, months ahead of schedule. And as September's sun failed to deliver the warmth it promised, and the first cold winds blew through empty orchards and half-harvested fields, the people of 1816 began to ask questions that chilled more deeply than any wind could. If this was summer, then what, in heaven's name, would winter bring? And as the New Englanders bundled their children in scratchy wool in the middle of July, and tried to read signs in the color of the clouds or the cries of the crows across the Atlantic Ocean, Europe, too, found itself caught in a season that refused to behave. The continent, already no stranger to the shifting moods of weather, now bore witness to a sky that remained perpetually heavy and cloaked in thick, unrelenting grey. From the misty hills of Scotland to the river-laced heartlands of Germany, from the French countryside, drowsy with vineyards, to the tucked-away villages of Switzerland, the air felt wrong, not in a way that could be easily named, but in the bones of farmers, in the stiffness of joints that should have loosened with spring warmth, and in the uneasy silence that hovered over fields where birds no longer sang. Rain fell too often, and with too much force, as if the skies above had forgotten how to weep gently. It came in long, slanting sheets, driven sideways by winds that cut through even the thickest cloaks. Crops, newly planted in what should have been the fertile promise of spring, began to rot in waterlogged earth, their roots gasping for air that never came. The rivers, fed by melting snow and ceaseless downpour, rose beyond their banks and carried away not only livestock but hope itself. In Germany, the Rhine, swollen and sullen, devoured grain stores and flooded homes, and in the lowlands of Belgium, once fertile pastures turned into shallow, mirror-like lakes where cows stood in dumb misery, too hungry to move. In Paris, the city of light dimmed under oppressive skies. The boulevards, once lively with market stalls and idle chatter, echoed instead with the clatter of hooves and the rustle of newsprint as worried Parisians read weather columns like tea leaves. Bread, already a staple tethered to unrest, began to rise in price again. Bakers, uncertain if flour would continue arriving in carts from the countryside, began to pad their loaves with bark and bran. In the wine-growing regions to the south, vines curled in confusion, refusing to ripen. Grapes, small and bitter, hung from the gnarled arms of vines that had known better years, and winemakers began to eye their barrels and wonder how long the good vintages would last before they too turned sour. In the Alps, where seasons already flirted with the edge of cruelty, the peasants of Switzerland noticed something even stranger than the chill. The snow line no longer retreated. The peaks, white and familiar, kept their frost, while even the lower meadows remained dusted in late June. Glaciers, which usually groaned and shrunk with summer melt, now advanced subtly but steadily, as if claiming ground that humans had only ever borrowed. In the valleys, hay became rare, and the goats that once dotted the hills with curious bleats began to disappear from view. Some sold, others starved, still more eaten in desperation by those who had never tasted meat so early in the year. Priests in stone chapels gave longer sermons. They invoked scripture and storm. They reminded villagers of the plagues of Egypt and the wrath of God. In many corners of the continent, talk turned darker. People who had not seen sunlight in weeks began to fear they had done something wrong, not just as individuals, but as a collective species. In the minds of the deeply religious, and even among the skeptical, the idea took root that perhaps the Lord was displeased. Perhaps this endless grey was penance for the sins of nations, for the bloodshed of Napoleon's wars that had so recently scorched Europe's soil, or for the arrogance of Enlightenment thinkers who had dared to place man above the divine. Superstitions, dormant like old seeds, began to sprout again in the cracks of logic. In the villages of Bavaria and the highlands of Scotland, old women whispered of witches and curses. Strange weather was a harbinger, they said, a sign that something was wrong not just in the heavens but in the natural order of things. In some places, processions were held where peasants walked barefoot through mud-slicked roads, praying for the return of the sun. Crosses were raised, candles were lit and placed in windows that had seen nothing but drizzle and shadow for weeks on end. But no light broke the clouds, no warmth came. Merchants in London too began to feel the pinch. Ships arrived from abroad with spoiled cargoes, coffee mildewed, spices clumped with damp. Letters from correspondents in the Americas spoke of cold winds and ruined corn, and British traders wondered if they were witnessing the beginning of some global decline. The newspapers, ever eager for a headline, began to print strange rumors. Some said a comet had passed too close to the Earth. Others blamed sunspots. A few blamed America, or the Turks, or the sins of factory owners blackening the sky with coal smoke. But none could explain why it was July, and yet the roses had not bloomed. Among the poorest of Europe, hunger arrived quietly at first, like a knock in the night that no one wanted to answer, but by the end of summer, it burst through the door. Families who once sold surplus at market now held on to every potato, every cabbage, every egg. Mothers skipped meals for their children. Fathers went farther afield to hunt rabbits that seemed fewer in number, perhaps sensing the disturbance too. In cities, food riots erupted. In the countryside, thieves became bold, stealing from gardens and breaking into pantries, and all the while, The skies remained stubbornly grey, the air too chill, and the hearts of men too full of dread. Yet even in this gloomy mosaic, moments of kindness flickered, neighbours shared what little they had. Towns banded together to petition their lords for relief, and in some cases, grain stores were opened. Children, unaware of the scale of the strangeness, played in puddles and pretended the rain was part of some long magical game. And in drawing rooms and salons, the poets and thinkers, cut off from their usual summer travels, turned inward and began to write. In darkened villas in Switzerland, ink met paper, and stories of monsters and storms were born from the very grey that surrounded them. And so, while the continent shivered beneath layers of wool and worry, and while the fields stayed bare, and the sky refused to break, the strange summer pressed on, wrapping all of Europe in a silence broken only by the wind, until even the artists, restless and trapped indoors, began to dream of thunder and horror. And as the cold skies hung low over villages and cities alike, refusing to lift even as the calendar crept deeper into what should have been the heart of summer, the whispers of dread that had curled their way through the countryside now became a low, growling hunger that could not be silenced with prayer or patience. Across the broad sweep of Europe, from the smoky lanes of London to the cobbled plazas of Vienna, bread, simple, humble, once taken for granted, was vanishing from shelves, and with it vanished the calm civility of the streets. In France, the land of revolutions and feasts, where bakery windows once showcased golden loaves like offerings to the gods, the glass panes now reflected nothing but anxious faces and empty hands, and in those faces one saw a quiet desperation turning gradually into something less quiet, something that rattled iron gates and shattered store shutters with stones and shouts. The price of flour had begun its slow, merciless climb in the late spring, nudging upward by the week at first, then by the day, until the numbers on shop chalkboards had to be rewritten by the hour, erased almost as quickly as they were scrawled. Bakers, themselves at the mercy of dwindling supply chains and fearful millers who clutched their grain like treasure, were forced to raise prices or shutter their ovens altogether. And so it began, long lines outside every remaining bakery winding through alleys, curling past fountains and stables, growing longer even before dawn broke on another grey morning. People waiting in silence with cloth-wrapped coins in hand and little hope that there would be anything left by the time they reached the door. Mothers with infants on their hips, old men coughing in the damp, children too young to understand why their bellies growled. These were the scenes that unfolded day after day, as if time itself had frozen along with the weather. And yet, it was not just the lack of bread, but the sense that no one was in control, that no government, no nobleman, no bishop, no merchant had the power to bring back the sun or coax the fields into bearing grain, that truly began to fray the edges of the European order. In Saxony, in Württemberg, in parts of the Swiss cantons, townspeople who once obeyed curfews and honoured their mayors began to gather in the squares, not in reverent silence, but with raised fists and shouted demands. The language of the marketplace shifted, haggling gave way to accusation, pleading turned to threat. The baker who once knew every customer by name now bolted his doors from the inside, handing out loaves one at a time through a cracked window as soldiers watched from the street with unease. But even soldiers, strong and armed, could not still the panic rising in people's bones when the shelves were bare, and the smoke from nearby fields marked not harvest, but the burning of what could no longer be tended or saved. And so came the riots, first small and scattered, like sparks from a fire not yet fed, but soon swelling into something hotter, more dangerous. In Geneva, women broke into warehouses, hauling sacks of barley and potatoes through the streets like looted relics from a forgotten temple. In Paris, bakery doors were smashed open by hammer and stone, the counters overturned, the bread seized not as food but as justice. Some mobs marched towards city halls, demanding price controls or open granaries, only to be met with walls of guards who stood with bayonets crossed and orders that had come down from fearful officials behind locked doors. A few mayors, those who still dared speak from balconies, tried to calm the masses with promises of relief, of shipments from the countryside, of subsidies or aid, but the people had heard promises before, and they no longer trusted the echo of wealth from behind stone walls. Meanwhile, the rich, those who had always eaten well, whose tables were still graced with cheese and meat, wine and warm bread, found themselves trapped in a strange paradox. They were untouched by hunger, yet not by fear. For even behind high garden walls and carriage gates, the sound of riots reached their drawing rooms. The smoke of torched grain carts drifted into their parlors, and the knowledge settled in their hearts that desperation knew no boundaries. Some fled to country estates, only to find that there too, the peasants were angry, and the food scarcer still. Others tried to buy peace with coin or bread, but generosity from above only seemed to remind the starving that they were being fed scraps by those who still feasted. In England, where newspapers printed stories from the continent with a mixture of horror and distant sympathy, the riots soon arrived at their own doorstep. In East Anglia, protesters overturned carts of imported grain, shouting that the goods were bound for foreign mouths while English children starved. In Cornwall and Devon, smuggling and theft grew so common that local sheriffs begged for more constables, more jail space, more rope. There were no great revolutions, not yet, not quite, but there was unrest, and in that unrest was the whisper of change. And all the while the skies refused to brighten. Clouds hovered, thick and unmoving, as if pressed against the earth by a hand too heavy to lift. Rain came without rhythm, sometimes torrential, sometimes merely sullen and cold, soaking the fields that might have yielded some late crop, had they only been given a little warmth, a little light. The wind carried not the scents of summer, but the scent of smoke, and wet hay and horses left without feed. At night, stars were rarely visible. The moon, when it appeared, seemed pale and distant, as though hiding behind a veil it could not shed. And under this muted sky, the breadlines grew longer still, the riots fiercer, and hope, always a fragile thing, began to shrink into the quiet corners of homes where candles flickered low, and children dreamed of bread they had once tasted. But if Europe trembled in fear and fury, then across the ocean, in the young towns of New England, another kind of desperation was taking shape, one shaped not by riots and mobs, but by isolation, frost, and the quiet unraveling of everything settlers believed they knew about the seasons and the soil. For there too, the summer was hiding, and there too, the earth had nothing to give. And while riots rumbled through the streets of continental cities, and the grain stores of Europe were pillaged by trembling hands and hollow eyes, further to the northwest, across the choppy grey waters of the Atlantic fringe, the island of Ireland was slipping silently into its own quiet tragedy, less violent perhaps than the mob cries of Berlin or the barricaded ovens of Lyon, but no less ruinous for its subtlety, for it came not with thunder or rage, but with rain, steady and endless and cold. The clouds hung low and mournful over the rolling green hills of Ulster and the misty coasts of Munster, and where the peat fields once welcomed the soft tread of workers' boots and the distant laughter of children, there was now only sodden earth, ankle-deep in water, where nothing rooted, nothing grew, and even the most stubborn shoots withered before their first breath of sun. The people of Ireland, long used to hardship, did not at first see anything unnatural in a rainy season that stretched its arms beyond the expected boundaries, for theirs was a land shaped by storm and wind, and a damp summer was no stranger to its soil. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks spilled into months, and still the sun remained a pale, shy ghost behind the curtains of fog, there came a creeping fear that this was something different, something deeper, something unspoken, that no prayers could pierce. The potato, that humble root which had sustained so many families through lean years, blackened and rotted in the ground before it could be lifted, and the fields, normally speckled with green, became graveyards of failed harvests. By early June, the rain fell with such persistence that farmers could scarcely remember the last day they had walked through their crops without mud clinging to their legs or water soaking their feet. Roofs leaked despite repairs, chimneys refused to draw, and homes filled with the sour smell of mildew and despair. Rivers swelled, not with the life-giving meltwater of spring, but with the runoff of saturated land, overflowing their banks and turning pastures into shallow lakes, where cows sank knee-deep in muck and bellowed at skies that gave no answer. In the cottages and hearths of County Mayo, of Sligo, of Wexford and beyond, families huddled in damp corners, passing thin broths between too many mouths. Children shivering, not from fever, but from the bone-deep cold that never seemed to lift, not even in July. The peat, harvested with great labor, and stored for warmth, burned fast, and gave little heat in chimneys, choked with moisture. And so they layered what rags they had, mothers wrapping their babes in shawls, already fraying at the edges, while fathers walked to market towns with pockets empty, and hopes even more so. For there was little food to buy, and less money to buy it with. Priests spoke of trials and tests of faith, reading somberly from pulpits to congregations that could scarcely listen through the sound of stomachs, growling and raindrops, tapping endlessly on warped roofs. And while the devout murmured rosaries and lit candles that flickered against damp stone walls, others began to whisper darker things, of punishment, of prophecy, of the end of days creeping in, not with fire, but with the slow drowning of all that was good and green. And yet, it was not only the land that suffered, but the people's spirit too. For what was worst was not just the hunger, or the cold, or the wetness that soaked their bones. It was the waiting, the unknowing, the long endless grey of days that never brightened, and nights that never brought rest. And as they looked out across waterlogged fields that once promised life, they began to feel not only helplessness, but abandonment. Those who could scrape together the means began to think of leaving, of ships bound for England, or even America, places whispered of, with both fear and hope. But the ports were choked with the desperate, and tickets cost more than most would see in a year. So they stayed, not out of choice, but out of chains made of poverty, and peat, and prayer. The British authorities, though informed of the worsening conditions, moved slowly, distracted by crises in their own cities, and the slow machine of empire could not turn fast enough to send grain. And when it did, the grain was expensive, or spoiled, or locked behind bureaucratic walls too high for hungry hands to climb. So the rain kept falling, and the skies remained grey, and Ireland, whose people had endured centuries of hardship with a resilience carved into their bones, found itself once again bowing under a burden not of its own making, a burden from skies they could not read, and clouds they could not command. And as summer wore on into a season that bore no resemblance to warmth, and children who should have run barefoot through green meadows instead, sat pale and thin by smoky hearths, a quiet question grew in the hearts of the people. What if this never ended? What if the world had changed forever, and the sun would never return? Because just across the sea, the question was being asked too, not only in the hearts of the hungry, but in the minds of those trying to understand, trying to explain what had gone so terribly wrong in a world where the seasons no longer obeyed. And one man sitting by a rain-lashed window in London began to trace the outlines of something greater, something global, something almost invisible, something far stranger than any storm they had known before. And so, with the rain still falling in Ireland, and the skies over Europe remaining a somber grey, the crisis deepened in ways no one could have truly predicted. While the storms and crop failures devastated the fields, another quieter, invisible storm was beginning to gather force inside village markets, merchant stalls, and city alleyways. It was not a storm of clouds or thunder, but of price and panic, a slow creeping economic collapse that showed its face in the simplest of places, the price of a loaf of bread. In normal times, a loaf was so ordinary, so unremarkable, that people rarely thought about its cost. It was a staple, a daily necessity, bought without ceremony, shared without thought, broken without regret. But in the year without a summer, as the climate turned bitter and the harvests failed, that simple loaf transformed into a kind of relic, precious, guarded, and increasingly unaffordable. By late summer of 1816, in towns across Europe, and even in parts of North America, the cost of bread had doubled, and in many places, it had tripled. People who once purchased a week's worth of flour with a silver coin now found that same coin barely bought enough for a day's ration. Merchants began to lock up their stores behind iron bars and thick shutters, no longer trusting the usual customs of open trade. They feared looters, yes, but even more, they feared their own neighbors, who might not steal out of cruelty or greed, but simply because their children hadn't eaten in 2 days. In London, the cobbled streets near Cornhill and Spitalfields filled with crowds each morning, not of busy shoppers, but of quiet, thin families, waiting outside bakeries before sunrise, hoping the deliveries would come. A mother might clutch her shivering daughter's hand, looking anxiously down the road for the flower carts that sometimes never appeared. In rural French villages, people began bartering again, as though the revolution had not brought progress but regression. A woman might trade her best shawl for a small bag of millet. A farmer might give away his last bottle of homemade wine for a heel of bread. And in cities like Vienna or Zurich, some families took to tearing apart their furniture, using old wood for fuel, and then selling whatever was left, frames, chairs, even wedding chests, for a few precious coins to buy something to eat. These were not the poor who were used to hunger. These were families who once lived comfortably, modestly, with enough to eat, and a roof to shelter them. But now hunger seeped into every home like an unwelcome guest that would not leave. In Switzerland, one of the worst-hit nations, local newspapers reported daily price surges. The cost of rye and barley rose so high that some bakeries began mixing sawdust into their dough to make supplies last. It was not uncommon to see people arguing in the street, fists clenched over a loaf that had been promised, but not delivered. And always, behind it all, was the silent understanding that there was no solution in sight. The skies were not clearing, the crops were not returning, and the bread would not get cheaper. Children suffered the most. Their growing bodies could not endure days of watery porridge or broth made from boiled nettles. Teachers in small schools began to notice the signs, the way the children stared blankly at their slates, how their hands trembled when they wrote, how they no longer played at recess, but instead sat quietly, trying to preserve energy. In some parishes, churches opened their doors at night, offering crusts to those in need, but the lines grew too long, and the crusts ran out too quickly, and amid this, the choices families faced grew crueler. A man might choose to sell his winter boots for food, knowing he would walk barefoot through the coming frost. A mother might go without eating for 2 days, so her baby could nurse. Some families split apart, fathers leaving to search for work or food in distant towns, hoping to send back something, anything, while mothers stayed behind, telling their children fairy tales to distract them from their hollow stomachs. Meanwhile, speculation flourished. Some grain merchants hoarded supplies, waiting for prices to rise further before selling. In back rooms and barns, black markets formed. Flour sold in secret, at 4 times the official price, to those desperate enough to pay, and many were. They sold brooches, family Bibles, locks of hair from dead loved ones, anything of value, just to survive another week. And in every marketplace, there was the sound, not of bustling trade, but of pleading voices. A woman crying as she asked a baker to trust her, to give her a small roll she would pay for later. A boy offering to carry firewood, in exchange for a biscuit. The muffled sobs of someone turned away. Governments struggled to respond. In some cities, officials imposed price controls, hoping to stop the rise, but this often made things worse. Bakers closed their shops, unwilling to sell at a loss, and the black market grew even stronger. In other places, grain shipments were requisitioned by soldiers or local councils, leading to riots from those who saw the wagons rolling past, but were told there was nothing left for them. In many towns, the word bread was whispered like a curse or a prayer, fragile, elusive, almost sacred. As autumn approached, there was no relief. The frost came early, hardening the ground, and killing the final hopes of a late harvest. Root cellars were emptier than they should have been. Granaries that once held months of provisions were now silent and echoing. People who once planned meals by the week, now lived day to day, meal by meal, sometimes without one at all. And so, the price of a loaf was no longer just a figure marked on a chalkboard. It was a measure of a family's hope, a symbol of dignity lost or preserved, a dividing line between those who would endure and those who would not. But even as the hunger spread and the cold crept in, the world did not stop turning. Somewhere beyond the frost-covered hills and behind the clouds that blotted out the sun, another storm was beginning to gather, not in the skies this time, but in the hearts of those who were slowly losing patience with waiting. For if the governments would not act, and if the skies would not warm, then perhaps, they reasoned, it was time to act themselves. And while the world groaned beneath the weight of hunger and frost, while families counted the cost of loaves, and watched their children sleep with empty bellies and cold toes, there were others who, though spared the very edge of famine, found themselves affected in stranger ways, those who observed the world not just with stomachs, but with eyes and pens and brushes. Across Europe and beyond, the skies continued to wear their dull grey shrouds, and the sun retreated behind the veil of invisible dust that clung stubbornly to the upper atmosphere. A change began to creep, not just into the crops and calendars of the people, but into their minds, their moods, and their imaginations. For the artists, the writers, the wanderers of thought, something about the light itself, muted, uncertain, tinged always with a smoky haze, seemed to settle into their spirits and shape the very nature of their work. Their gaze turned outward and inward at once, their brushes slower, their colours colder, and their words more laden with longing. Painters across Europe began to notice it first, though not all could name what it was they were seeing. In England, a young J.M.W. Turner looked westward toward the evening sky, and saw not the familiar golden hues of sunset, but strange bands of crimson and orange, bleeding together like bruises behind wisps of cloud. These sunsets were not the brilliant kind that spoke of warmth or summer. They were apocalyptic, slow and brooding, as if the sun were dying slowly each night and mourning its own fading glow. Turner began to capture these skies with his oils, laying down pigments that would later be recognized by scientists as visual records of volcanic particles refracting light in ways not seen again for more than a century. His canvases were like weather reports in paint, depictions of a world that had tilted slightly out of its normal rhythm, brushed with a sadness that seemed to come not from the subject, but from the air itself. The poets too found themselves caught in the shadow of this dimmed world. In the summer of 1816, that same strange summer without warmth or sun, a group of young writers gathered at Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Among them the poet Lord Byron, the gloomy Percy Bysshe Shelley, and the young, thoughtful Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who would later become Mary Shelley. They had come for the scenery, for the bright Swiss air and the reflective stillness of the lake, but what they found instead was a sky that brooded and spilled rain for days, a lake whipped by cold winds, and a mood so oppressive that they rarely ventured outside. Forced indoors by endless storms and the uncanny dimness of daylight, they turned to storytelling to pass the time, and it was there in the flickering candlelight of a rented villa shrouded in mist, that Mary Shelley began to weave the story of Frankenstein, a tale of science gone awry, of man's reach exceeding nature, of creation and destruction born not just from her imagination, but from the world outside the window, a world that itself seemed unnaturally stitched together. Lord Byron meanwhile penned his haunting poem Darkness, a vision of the world stripped of sunlight, a planet spinning in cold and silence, where mankind slowly succumbs to despair and cannibalism beneath the unending night. It was fiction, of course, but not far from the fears whispered in taverns and parlours across the continent, where the sight of snow in June or frozen streams in August had begun to erode people's sense of stability. For the common man, these were omens. For the artist, they were inspiration, albeit of a sombre and shadowed sort. Even in the world of science, where imagination bowed to observation and theory, the strange light of 1816 did not go unnoticed. Astronomers recorded the persistent dimming of the sun, the odd halos that sometimes surrounded it, and the reddening of the moon on cloudless nights. Some speculated about sunspots, others feared cosmic causes, and a few wondered whether some far-off celestial event had veiled the earth in gloom. But few suspected the real cause, a mountain far across the sea that had erupted in fire and fury the year before, flinging skyward a shroud so vast and fine that it wrapped the planet without ever being seen. In the parlours of Vienna, the salons of Paris, and the drawing rooms of London, society continued its rituals, but even these seemed more subdued. Balls and gatherings were held with fewer candles, as even the wealthy began to feel the strain of high food prices and poor supply. Clothes darkened in tone, mirroring the grey skies above, and a certain melancholia began to settle into the fashion of the age. This was the dawn of what would be remembered as the Romantic era, not only in art, but in mood and spirit, a turn toward the introspective, the tragic, the beautiful in suffering. The very air of 1816 seemed to sigh with poetry, not of joy, but of loss, and yet, beneath the brushstrokes and the ink and the quiet laments of culture, the world moved on, slowly, unevenly. The dim skies persisted through the year, and the strange weather continued to ripple outward. For while the artists painted and the poets wrote, the markets still strained, the fields remained barren, and the people, ordinary, hungry, shivering, still searched the skies for a break in the clouds that never quite came. And as these long dim evenings stretched into autumn, the world wondered, would the sun ever return in full? Would the strange year end with some kind of reckoning, or simply fade into winter like a dream unfinished? And while poets and painters wandered through dim and dripping landscapes, capturing the mournful pallor that hung over their world, another kind of creation was stirring indoors, born not from light and clarity, but from the eerie hush and shadows cast by thunderclouds and candlelight. For far from the hungry cities and flooded fields, nestled beside the storm-racked waters of Lake Geneva, a group of young English intellectuals found themselves confined by rain and chill in a borrowed mansion, Villa Diodati, where the persistent gloom outside seemed to seep into their minds and moods, wrapping itself around their conversations like the heavy fogs that rolled down from the Alpine heights each morning. And it was here, on long July nights in 1816, that a young woman named Mary Godwin, travelling with her lover Percy Shelley and his young child, joined Lord Byron and his physician John Polidori in passing the time not with walks or swims or sunlit picnics, but with books, flickering candles and tales that veered, quite naturally, toward the macabre, the spectral and the strange. The thunder cracked over Lake Geneva like a warning drum, and the wind howled down the chimneys like a restless ghost. And in such a setting, so unnaturally cold for a midsummer's eve, so soaked in dread and atmosphere, it was no wonder that Byron proposed, half seriously, a ghost story competition among the friends, daring each to conjure the most chilling tale their minds could manage. And while Byron himself would begin and abandon a story of vampires and haunted mansions, and Polidori would pen a tale that would lay the groundwork for the modern vampire myth, it was Mary, only 18 years old at the time, who lay awake one night in the candle-lit bedroom, disturbed by the sound of distant thunder and the flicker of lightning across the wall, and imagined a different kind of monster, not the clawed or fanged beings of folk legend, but a creation of man himself, cobbled together from flesh and reanimated with science, a modern Prometheus born not of myth, but of the anxieties and questions of her age. And she would write, over the following months, through the continuing storms and strange grey days, a story that bore the mark of that summer's unease, not just in its content, which questioned the limits of human ambition and the terror of isolation, but in its very mood, the heavy sorrow and weight that clung to each sentence as though mirroring the oppressive skies under which it was imagined. And so Frankenstein was born, a novel of science and suffering, of unnatural creation and wandering through a cold, unwelcoming world, a reflection in fiction of the very reality outside their windows, where crops failed, where villages grew silent, and where even the stars at night seemed dulled by something unnatural in the sky. And though none of them could fully explain what was happening in the heavens, or why the warmth of summer had vanished without warning, there was in their writing and poetry an unconscious grasping toward it, a channeling of unease into something permanent, something artistic. And that storm-drenched summer, for all its discomforts and limitations, became legendary not just for its strange weather, but for the inspiration it seeded in minds already fertile with curiosity and fear. A strange gift of volcanic clouds and disrupted climate, one that would echo down centuries in the haunting figure of a creature stitched from corpses and cursed by loneliness. Yet while stories were shared in candlelit villas and books were quietly being born from the darkness, far beyond the lakeside calm and literary legacy, in cities and farms and cottages across the globe, the consequences of that relentless chill were turning ever more grim, and the very landscape of the world, its economies, its diets, Its migrations began to shift under the pressure of a climate no longer behaving by known rules, for this was not just a season of curious creativity, but the start of a long and bitter unraveling, as lives, livelihoods, and lands all struggled to adapt to a world where the sun no longer offered the warmth they had always trusted it to bring. And when the storms had passed, when the cold rain paused just long enough for the clouds to thin and the fog to roll aside, what lay beneath was not a world refreshed or reborn, but a world worn thin by hunger, by loss, by a quiet despair that spread across villages and fields like a stain too deep to scrub away. And so they came, one by one at first, then in groups, then in desperate columns that stretched along the muddy roads like sorrow made visible, men with hollow cheeks and women clutching silent infants, children wrapped in rags and old soldiers walking with bowed heads, their boots worn through at the toes, their backs bent not just by the weight of sacks and bundles, but by the unbearable ache of not knowing where to go next. And in their hands they carried no banners, no weapons, only empty pots and cracked bowls, and perhaps, if they were lucky, a crust of bread traded for a family heirloom the day before. They moved in silence mostly, for talking took energy, and invited unwanted attention. And there were too many stories of towns that drove the hungry away, of landowners who sent armed men to beat them back from the hedgerows, or of entire villages that locked their gates at the first sign of strangers on the road. And so they kept to the paths and ditches, sleeping under trees when they could find them, under bridges when the rain returned, and beneath the eaves of abandoned barns or churches, listening always for the sound of hooves or the cough of others in the dark. And at times the roads would wind past the great houses of the wealthy, tall and pale on the hillsides, windows aglow with candlelight, smoke rising from chimneys like a cruel reminder that warmth and fullness still existed somewhere, just not for them. Some of these mansions were now ringed with walls or hastily built barricades of wood and stone, guards posted at the gates, dogs loosed at night to discourage any approach, and inside, the owners, landed gentry, minor nobility, or merchants fattened on old profits, watched the slow-moving processions with a mixture of pity and fear, unsure whether to send help or sound alarms, for even the rich could feel the world shifting, and though their cellars were stocked and their pantries full, they knew that such abundance was no longer promised, and that the desperation outside their doors might one day force its way in. In the countryside, rumors spread faster than bread, tales of hidden hoards of grain, of monasteries with soup lines, of towns where kind-hearted priests gave out alms each morning. And so the wanderers moved from rumor to rumor, from one whisper of hope to the next, often only to find locked doors, shuttered churches, or long queues of others who had heard the same tale. And there, at the end of each new trail, disappointment greeted them again, cold and certain, like the sky that refused to break into blue, no matter how long they waited. And so people wandered still, not just for food but for some sense of movement, for walking numbed the hunger a little, and sitting made it worse, and children cried less when cradled in swaying arms, when the rhythm of a journey gave them some small distraction from the emptiness in their bellies. And even those too old or weak to keep up were not always left behind. They were pulled on crude sleds, carried in wheelbarrows, or pushed in carts with broken wheels, not because there was hope of finding salvation, but because abandoning them would be admitting, finally, that none of this was temporary, that this strange cold hunger might truly be the new shape of the world. Along the roads, the dead were sometimes buried and sometimes not, depending on the season, the soil, and the time it would take to dig a grave, and often a man or woman who had fallen behind one night was simply not there the next morning, and no one spoke of it, because there were no words left to offer, no prayers strong enough to chase away the slow silence that crept into their thoughts like frost into old floorboards. And though they feared death, they feared hunger more, for at least death was final, but hunger dragged on and on, day after day, a slow unmaking of the self, a cruel erosion of strength and will. And so the roads grew more crowded with each passing week, not with carriages or wagons, but with footsteps, soft and uncertain, and the land itself seemed to sag beneath the weight of all this movement, all this suffering. And while the wealthier sought refuge in southern climates, Italy, Provence, even parts of Spain, where the sun still burned however dimly, and the vineyards had not yet drowned, those left behind, the poor and voiceless, could only walk on, hoping perhaps to find a town where the granary had not yet emptied, or a market stall where a heel of bread could be earned by hauling wood or sweeping ash. Though more often than not, there was nothing to be found but the echo of their own footsteps, and the distant sound of church bells tolling for someone else who had not survived the night. And still they walked, far from the dimly lit roads of Europe, across the vast and rolling Atlantic. The cold found its way into the wooden walls and thatched roofs of another world, one younger and wilder, though no less vulnerable. And there in the sprawling frontier of rural New England and the settlements that clung to the edges of Canadian wilderness, the people awoke one summer morning to find that the earth no longer obeyed its old calendar, that the rules had shifted without warning, and that the warmth they had counted on to raise their corn and dry their firewood had vanished like breath in the frost, leaving behind not spring, not summer, but something that was neither, an unfamiliar season that chilled the bones yet offered no harvest, that clouded the sky, and blackened the fields with no care for planting or prayer. It had begun quietly at first, with nights that lingered longer than they should have, with mornings that never truly warmed, and crops that sprouted reluctantly, as though unsure whether to emerge at all, and the farmers, hardened by years of hardship, simply tightened their belts and sowed again, shrugging at the wind, hoping that the sun would find its strength by July. But it did not, and when August came, it brought with it not the golden hum of cicadas, or the thick scent of ripening wheat, but a hard frost, sudden and silent, that crept in like a thief, curling its icy fingers around green shoots and soft ears, choking the life out of them before sunrise, so that by morning, entire fields were reduced to brittle husks and frozen stalks that crumbled to the touch. In Vermont, in Maine, across the Adirondacks and up through the deep woods of Lower Canada, the same grim story unfolded. The maple trees gave no syrup that year, their sap frozen deep within the trunks or spoiled by unseasonable chills. The apple blossoms fell without fruiting, and the wild berries, so often a secret lifeline in lean months, never bloomed at all. And so the people turned inward, toward pantries lined with glass jars and barrels of dried beans. But even these stores were meager, drawn down by the long winter that had refused to end, and by spring that had failed to begin, and they soon discovered that survival would require more than discipline or prayer. It would demand sacrifice of things once unthinkable. Horses were among the first to go, not because they were easy to spare, but because they were heavy eaters. And in a land where hay could no longer be grown, and corn was stunted and pale, there simply wasn't enough to feed both man and beast. And so the animals that had ploughed the fields and pulled the wagons were led out behind barns and slaughtered quietly, the meat boiled and salted, the hides saved for repairing shoes or tacking roofs. And after that came the pigs, the chickens, and in some cases, even the family dogs, though no one spoke of that aloud. And with each loss, a little more of the settlers' hope vanished into the smoky air above the hearth, where weeds now simmered in pots instead of stews, and where wild roots and dried moss became part of every meal. Weeds indeed became a strange salvation. Lamb's quarters, pigweed and dandelion leaves were foraged by candlelight or beneath grey dawns, picked from the edges of paths and fence lines, bundled into aprons, washed in cold water, and boiled until tender, until their bitterness faded into something bland and filling. And children learned which plants could be eaten, and which ones brought pain, and mothers learned to stretch meals by thickening broths with bark or crushed acorns, and fathers ventured deeper into the woods each day, hoping to trap a squirrel or snare a rabbit, though even these had grown scarce, having sensed perhaps in their silent way that something in the world was wrong. The forests no longer whispered with the same soft breeze, and the lakes no longer steamed at dawn. Everything was colder, harder, quieter, and as the days shortened once more, families began to realize that the winter ahead would not be like any they had known before, and many, faced with that cruel truth, made the decision to leave, to abandon the homesteads they had carved from wild land with blistered hands and stubborn hearts, leaving behind cabins that had taken years to build and dreams that had no soil left to root in. And they moved southward, toward towns rumored to still have grain, toward relatives who might take them in, toward anything that smelled of firewood and bread. But not all could leave. For some there was nowhere to go, no one waiting beyond the ridges or across the rivers, and so they stayed, bundled in old furs and patched quilts, eating whatever could be found, bartering heirlooms for flour, melting snow in iron kettles, burning furniture when the woodpile ran out, and keeping journals by candlelight, not to preserve wisdom or record history, but simply to stay sane, to give shape to the shapeless suffering that had taken hold of their world. And in those pages are lines that speak not of anger or panic, but of weariness, a slow surrender to the idea that nature itself had turned against them, that the seasons had betrayed them, and that what had once been predictable was now unknowable. And yet, in the deep of night, when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire guttered low, some still prayed, not for abundance, not even for warmth, but for mercy, for a single day without cold, a meal that didn't leave them weaker, a season that came when it should. And though the snow had not yet fallen, they felt its presence already, like a shadow on the horizon, waiting. And so, with illness carried on the breath of every coughing child and hunger gnawing endlessly at bellies long emptied, the afflicted did what those in desperation have always done. They moved, along every muddy path and crumbling cobblestone road of the European countryside. The silhouettes of migrating families grew darker against the pale sky. They left villages that had ceased to provide, towns that had turned away the hungry, and cities so overwhelmed that even charity had begun to close its doors. Mothers with infants wrapped in threadbare cloth walked silently behind carts pulled by gaunt horses, or none at all, and men once proud of their land now leaned on walking sticks, fashioned from broken branches, eyes dulled by exhaustion and shame. They followed rumors of distant bread, of warmer air somewhere further south, and of lands less cursed by sky and soil alike. But wherever they went, they found only more refugees, more closed gates, and more warnings whispered between clenched teeth that no region had been spared. In France, entire communes emptied themselves in waves of hollow-eyed exodus, while in parts of Prussia and Saxony, villagers set fire to abandoned cottages, so they might not fall into the hands of vagrants, believing ruin to be better than risk. In England, parish relief broke under the strain, and as charity boards tightened their belts, they created new poor laws to sort the deserving from the undeserving, an echo of moral panic louder than the moans of the destitute. But far beyond the borders of Europe, across the Atlantic where maple trees stood silent and rivers crawled under grey clouds, a similar march had begun, not toward hope, but away from defeat. In Vermont, the hardest hit of all the American states, entire communities packed up wagons and vanished westward, carving roads through forest and mountain to begin again, far from the fields where the ground had betrayed them. It was here, amidst the slow exodus, that something subtle began to shift, not in the weather, which remained cruel, nor in governments, which remained overwhelmed, but in the people themselves, as hardship taught new rhythms of survival. Seed sharing became sacred ritual. Strangers broke bread with one another, not from abundance, but because despair had taught them what selfishness never could. And as they wandered and waited, huddled in barn lofts and under broken eaves, many kept looking to the skies not for sun, which still refused to return, but for any sign at all that the world might one day be kind again. In the wake of all that had been lost, harvests buried in frost, families reduced to whispers of their former selves, and villages emptying into the grey mist of roads without promise, there came not so much a solution as a surrender to motion. By the time autumn descended on the ruined summer of 1816, there was an exhaustion that no sleep could mend. It did not matter anymore if the fields might recover next year. Trust had been broken between people and their land, and so with stiff resolve and calloused hands, thousands decided not to wait for hope to return where it had so thoroughly failed. but instead to go and find it somewhere new. Thus began the slow ripple of exodus that would in time become a tidal force of migration, reshaping entire maps, not through politics or conquest, but through the quiet, determined shuffle of boots and wagon wheels across unsettled dirt. In New England, where the cold had been especially merciless, and the hills of Vermont had taken on the tone of graveyards, families who had weathered every winter for a generation now began to pack their belongings, not in preparation for another lean season, but for departure. Wagons once used to ferry crops to town now bore wooden furniture, iron pots, tattered quilts, sacks of what little remained of dried beans or flour, and the few heirlooms not yet sold for bread. Those who could not afford oxen pulled their carts themselves. The dreams of new lands were not romantic, they were pragmatic, desperate, and grimly hopeful. Tales spread in whispers and in church pews. The Ohio River Valley, it was said, had kinder soil. Kentucky had not seen frost in August. Illinois still bore green in its fields. These stories, often exaggerated or distorted by repetition, nonetheless held enough truth, or enough possibility of truth, to animate weary limbs and broken spirits. And so the migration began. Entire communities did not vanish overnight, but street by street and farm by farm, they thinned like mist before the morning sun. In towns like Barre, Montpelier, and Middlebury, the sound of hammering wagons and barking dogs echoed between hollow buildings. Inns once filled with traveling merchants now hosted farewell suppers, where neighbors cried into cracked cups and children stared blankly, too young to understand why their homes were no longer enough. Local newspapers printed stories of new territories opening up, offering land for cheap or sometimes for free, provided one was brave or desperate enough to tame it. And many were. Vermont alone lost thousands in a few short years, its population bleeding into New York, Ohio, and beyond. By 1820, the census would reveal entire counties where the only growth was in ghosts and memories. But not all went west. Some headed south toward warmer climates where the cold had bitten less deeply. Carolina roads saw the rise of northern families, asking questions in strange accents, seeking shelter beneath Spanish moss and warmer skies. Others simply moved town to town, hoping each next stop would be the one where the soil remembered how to grow and the wind forgot how to punish. They moved through Massachusetts and into Pennsylvania, from Connecticut into the Hudson Valley, and even as far as Missouri, where the promise of statehood and new lands glimmered like a distant lantern in fog. These migrants were not the image of the classic pioneer with rifle slung and eyes on glory. They were hollow-eyed fathers walking beside overburdened carts, mothers shielding their infants with shawls as the rain returned, and teenagers silent from too many nights without dinner. Yet they moved with purpose. For every mile of misery behind them, there remained 1 mile ahead that might just be different. And along the roads they traveled, new settlements took root, not of grand homesteads but of tents, lean-tos, and hastily erected cabins where people shared food, stories, and tools in the kind of solidarity that only hardship can forge. The dreams that drove them were not just of food and shelter, though those were first and foremost. Many dreamed of land, yes, but not just to possess it, to control it, or to profit from it. They dreamed of land that would not betray them, of a patch of earth that would yield to seed, of sunlight that would last longer than a few hours, of mornings that smelled of dew instead of fear. It was this modest, almost sacred hope that powered their tired feet and soothed their aching backs when campfires hissed in the twilight. In this way, the year without a summer did more than cause suffering, it redirected it. It carved new paths through forests and across plains, reshaping the demographic and agricultural future of a continent, not through grand design, but through the cumulative choices of thousands of displaced souls chasing warmth and soil that might remember mercy. In towns left behind, the effects of this migration were profound. Churches stood half empty, stores closed for lack of patrons, and fields went untilled as their stewards vanished into the west. Local economies buckled, young men disappeared from militia rolls and work crews. Even cemeteries bore the mark, graves dug for those who never died, only moved on, their absence mourned like a death in every home that could not afford to follow. Yet in the newly settled territories, the influx brought new life. Towns in Ohio doubled in size. Roads in Indiana that were once deer trails became busy with oxen carts and shouting children. Post offices, schools and barns sprang up with astonishing speed, each nail driven by hands hardened by the cold they fled. And as they planted their first hopeful seeds into unfamiliar soil, many dared to dream again. Some found success, rich harvests, sturdy homes and neighbors whose roots grew alongside theirs. Others found only new difficulties, different soil, unfamiliar seasons, isolation, but even these were preferable to the helplessness left behind. For better or worse, their dreams of new lands were not illusions. They were invitations to try again, to believe that somewhere beyond the frost-bitten fields and endless rain, there still existed a place where life could begin anew. If you turn the yellowing pages of forgotten journals, tucked away in attics or locked behind dusty glass cabinets in obscure archives, you begin to hear the whispers of 1816, not as some cold academic fact or statistical oddity, but as a deeply personal, bewildering experience for those who lived through it. In these handwritten testimonies, sometimes scribbled hastily in the margins of religious texts or between domestic records of births and deaths, the year emerges as a phantom, a presence that clung to the corners of homes and minds like smoke that would not lift. One such voice belonged to a minister in rural Vermont, whose daily observations recorded more weather than scripture. His entries, once filled with hopeful notes about thawing earth or birdsong, turned darker and more confused as April turned into May, and the frost refused to leave. "Still the fields are iron," he wrote in mid-May, his pen pressing deeper into the parchment, "and God sends snow in the season of planting. Is this his punishment, or is the earth unwell?" Such quiet queries, threaded with both faith and doubt, are repeated again and again across these small human records. In Scotland, a young woman named Elspeth, whose family worked at a modest plot near the hills outside Inverness, kept a diary that was mostly a collection of weather observations and small domestic updates: how the sheep were lambing, whether her father's joints ached from the cold, how many jars of preserves had been spoiled by the damp. But in July, her tone shifted. "It snowed again," she wrote simply, then nothing for 3 days. When she resumed, her penmanship seemed more hurried, nervous even. "The lambs are all gone. Father says to sell the good plough horse. I've never seen him cry before." Even the more educated minds, clergymen, doctors, local scribes, struggled to articulate what was happening, caught between rational explanation and the ancient pull of superstition. In parts of Germany, parish registers included notations of unseasonable blizzards beside records of burials, as if the weather itself were a mourner. In France, notaries recorded with unusual frequency the forced sales of land, or the pledging of heirlooms for a few francs to buy grain. In villages with no newspapers, and little contact with cities, the strangeness of the year was preserved in local law, some of it dutifully transcribed in church annals by clerics more curious than most. There was something deeply haunting about the simplicity of the language people used to describe the sky. In many of these diaries, the sun is not described as dimmed by volcanic ash, or even obscured by haze. Instead, it is just missing. "It did not rise today, only a strange red behind the hills," wrote a schoolmaster in Switzerland. "I could not see my hand's shadow on the desk until near noon." Such phrases appear again and again, that the sun was late, or sickly, or seemed to shine without warmth, like a candle seen through thin cloth. In New England, several families kept almanacs not just as agricultural guides, but as private records. A widow in Connecticut, with 6 children and no husband since the last war, wrote by candlelight in August. "The beans blackened in the pods, the corn turned white before harvest. I buried the youngest child on Tuesday. I cannot remember the warmth of last summer." Her words sit alone on the page, as if even grief could not quite thaw the ink. Children, too, made note of it in the only ways they knew how. In a preserved schoolhouse workbook found in Nova Scotia, the penciled drawing of a tree appears 6 times beside different months, and in every picture, the tree is bare. The child, aged 10, had scrawled, "Still cold, Mama keeps fire burning always." Teachers reported students being distracted, often tired or hungry, unable to concentrate as cold drafts cut through cracks in wooden walls, and as weak sun failed to dry the ink on their slates. In cities, newspaper clippings survive in greater number, offering a more formal, though still unsettled, lens into the year. A Paris paper lamented in July that the air refuses its duties, while a Boston publication speculated on whether the sun itself was undergoing some celestial transformation. Others blamed sunspots or comets, and in the more anxious corners of the press, one finds apocalyptic warnings, revivals of medieval prophecies, or doomsday sermons published beside grain prices and market closures. Yet alongside these grand speculations were the quieter, human notes: missing children, runaway horses, appeals for bread, reports of thefts from garden plots. There is a kind of echo in all these accounts, not merely in their shared observations, but in their emotional cadence. Confusion gives way to fear, fear hardens into resignation, and in a few, rare cases, resignation blossoms into some fragile hope. A letter from a schoolteacher in Massachusetts, addressed to his brother who had emigrated to Ohio, offered this: "If the sun returns next spring, I will join you. If not, I shall try to teach by firelight, and pray the children remember how warmth once felt." Even the poetry of the time, usually reserved for the aristocracy or educated elite, turned somber. Verses described not summer meadows or May blossoms, but barren fields, dead birds, and skies that wept cold tears. In the quiet homes of the middle class, women sewed by windows streaked with frost in midsummer, often pausing to stare out at the barren garden that once fed their children. Their hands, usually quick with needles, slowed under the weight of memories that no longer matched the seasons outside. What makes this chapter of history so striking is not only the climate event itself, but how intimately people recorded it without understanding it. Without the benefit of global communication, or modern meteorology, or volcanic science, they could not know that a mountain half a world away had stolen their summer. Yet they documented it anyway, faithfully, painfully, beautifully, writing down a story that would one day help the rest of the world make sense of a sunless year. These diary entries, these notes on ledger margins, these letters scrawled with frozen ink and trembling fingers, are now perhaps the most honest record we have of what it meant to live through that long shadow. Because science may tell us what happened, but the people, in their own fading words, tell us how it felt. There were times in that long and sullen year, when even the most loyal citizen looked toward their leaders, and saw not salvation, but silence. As frost lingered well into summer, and mouths grew hungrier with each passing day, governments across Europe and North America found themselves locked in paralysis, their finely stitched robes of power ill-suited for the raw, unexpected cold that had swept over their lands. Ministers muttered in Parliament, monarchs penned decrees, and town councils convened beneath flickering candlelight. But the strange truth persisted: no one knew quite what to do. For while the skies had dimmed and the crops had withered, it was not war that plagued the people, nor plague, nor rebellion, but something far more insidious, a mystery of the heavens, and a slow unraveling of the old systems meant to keep people fed and warm. In London, members of Parliament debated the rising cost of bread, their voices echoing off the chamber walls, as if hoping the sound alone might summon a solution. Reports arrived daily from the countryside, of failed barley harvests, of peasants selling heirlooms for oats, of parish poorhouses stretched beyond capacity. But the machinery of government turned slowly, and more often than not, turned inwards. Some lawmakers blamed French trade restrictions, others, the laziness of rural labourers. A few, perhaps more clear-eyed, admitted that something stranger was afoot. Yet, policies came too little, too late. Price controls were suggested, but rarely enforced. Grain reserves were whispered of, but seldom released. Relief committees were formed, but operated with the glacial pace of bureaucracy, while hunger moved swiftly through the streets. In France, the Bourbon monarchy, restored not long before, faced its own reckoning. Having returned from exile with promises of stability, King Louis XV now watched his realm slide into famine, his subjects gathering in angry knots outside bakeries, their eyes hollow and untrusting. The countryside, always a barometer of French unrest, murmured with discontent. Prefects sent letters warning of growing tensions, of villages where no bread had been baked in weeks, of livestock dying from starvation, of families who had begun boiling grass. The king's ministers proposed modest subsidies for bread, but implementation faltered. Corruption and inefficiency plagued local distributions, and grain shipments sent from city centers often vanished along the way, sold on black markets or hoarded by the powerful. In some regions, the gendarmerie was ordered to guard grain stores, not from foreigners or invading armies, but from the very citizens they were sworn to protect. Germany, fragmented into a patchwork of states and duchies, offered no more coordinated response. In Prussia, officials dispatched envoys to assess the situation, who returned with grim reports and vague recommendations. In Bavaria, small food relief programs were announced in towns such as Augsburg and Regensburg, where charitable kitchens offered watery soup and dry crusts to lines that grew longer by the day. The Habsburg Empire fared no better. In Vienna, imperial bureaucrats tried to manage the crisis through quotas and emergency rations, but the needs of the population far exceeded what the slow apparatus of empire could deliver. In the provinces, local lords were left to their own devices, and many either lacked the means or the will to offer aid. Some gave alms, others turned away beggars from their gates. A few, fearing riots, hired extra guards and locked away their storehouses beneath iron locks. Switzerland, small and mountainous, found its people isolated in pockets of snowbound misery. Canton officials attempted to ration bread and distribute emergency provisions, but transport was hindered by weather and terrain. Alpine passes remained blocked for weeks longer than usual, and in the narrow valleys where towns clung to rivers and slopes, the cold seemed to settle like a curse. Relief came in trickles, not tides. In some villages, neighbors shared what little they had, but elsewhere, desperation turned into hoarding and fear. Municipal authorities pleaded for outside help, but none came, who after all had enough to share. Across the Atlantic, in the still young United States, the federal government of 1816 was simply not built for crisis. There was no central welfare system, no nationwide relief agency, no formal mechanism for feeding a starving population. President James Madison, near the end of his term, issued no sweeping proclamations. Instead, help was left to local governments, churches and private citizens. In New England, town meetings were held in chilly halls to discuss how to allocate scarce resources. Some towns voted to reduce taxes or waive debts for farmers whose fields had failed. In others, charitable societies formed ad hoc, offering firewood and sacks of flour to the most destitute. But these efforts, noble as they were, could not match the scale of need. Even in cities like Boston and New York, officials found themselves overwhelmed. As migrants poured in from ruined farms, seeking work or relief, urban poverty swelled, almshouses overflowed, and charitable hospitals reported unprecedented numbers of patients suffering from malnutrition or exposure. Mayors issued calls for calm, for compassion, for charity, but they had no funds to give, no granaries to open. And in Washington, D.C., Congress debated tariffs and infrastructure, while the sky outside remained a dull silvery gray and the Potomac shimmered with unnatural stillness beneath the cold. Not all efforts were failures. In a few places, small triumphs flickered like lanterns in the dark. In Vermont, towns pooled resources to create communal food banks. In parts of Canada, British authorities authorized emergency shipments of flour from military depots to civilian populations. And in Germany, a few enlightened nobles opened their estates to the hungry, offering both employment and shelter. But these were exceptions, not the rule. The truth was simple and stark. The world had not prepared for a year without summer, because no one had imagined such a thing was possible. The systems of governance, slow, reactive, rooted in the predictable rhythms of season and harvest, were ill-equipped for chaos. And while politicians argued, and clerks filed reports, and scribes drafted proclamations, people waited. They waited in frostbitten cottages, in crumbling townhouses, in muddy fields beneath storm-darkened skies. They waited for the sun to return, for the crops to grow, for their leaders to act. But the year dragged on, and the cold remained. By the end of 1816, faith in governments had eroded in many places, not always in revolution or rebellion, but in the quiet, resigned way that people lose trust when promises go unfulfilled. The people learned to survive without relying on those in power. They bartered, shared, stole, prayed, and in doing so they revealed a hard truth. Sometimes, it is not those who govern who save a nation in crisis, but those who endure. With the veil of volcanic ash slowly dispersing, the skies began, at long last, to lighten. By 1817, the seasons returned to something closer to normal, though the scars of that vanished summer remained etched into the minds, stomachs and records of a world that had been forced to adapt without understanding. In this section, we reflect on how deeply the events of 1816 altered the trajectory of societies across the Northern Hemisphere, not only in terms of hunger and migration, but in a deeper cultural sense. In North America, thousands who had been displaced by the relentless frost of the year without a summer chose not to return to their original homes. Instead, they pushed westward, populating the Ohio Valley and further territories, laying the early demographic foundations for the American Midwest. This strange climate disaster may well have helped shape the pace and pattern of westward expansion, not through force or conquest, but through quiet desperation. In Europe, famines and food riots spurred subtle reforms and further conversations about the role of government in alleviating suffering, even if most responses had come far too late. We look into how the trauma of that year seeped into religion and philosophy, altering the way people interpreted nature. The Enlightenment's faith in rationalism had been shaken by a disaster that arrived without warning and without explanation. For many, the unpredictable cruelty of the skies was a return to older understandings of nature as wrathful, mysterious, and tied to divine will. Superstition flared alongside science, yet, in the very chaos, seeds of discovery were planted. Scientists slowly began to suspect the link between volcanic eruptions and climate, though the tools did not yet exist to prove it. Keen observers noted the correlation between the Indonesian eruption and the strange global chill. This was the beginning of what would eventually become the field of climate science. Artists and writers, meanwhile, could not forget the gloom. From Byron's apocalyptic poems to Turner's fiery sunsets, the memory of the year without warmth would echo for decades. Even as food grew once more in the thawing soil, many remembered the cold. Children born during the famine carried its name. Many Tamboras or 1816’s would be recorded in church ledgers, a testament to how memory entwined with tragedy. The legacy of 1816 was not one of a single bad year but a chapter in a longer ongoing story, the story of human vulnerability to the Earth's hidden forces. It reminded the world that beneath the fragile rhythm of seasons lies a deeper rhythm, one governed by tectonic shifts, volcanic fury, and airborne dust too fine to see but powerful enough to change the course of empires and lives. Farmers learned new lessons in crop resilience. Communities began forming grain reserves. Wary of the unpredictable, the fear of another dark summer lingered, even as warmth returned. And so in the quiet restoration of 1817 and beyond, the world was not quite the same. The ash had settled, but the world had shifted, with new scars, new stories, and a deeper respect for the fragile blue planet they all called home. As the calendar turned, and the shadow of 1816 began to lift, the world emerged blinking into a new dawn, one tinged not only with the golden promise of returning sunlight, but with the grey memory of what had just passed. In 1817, the skies above Europe and North America began to clear. The persistent haze, once so ominous and thick, dissipated with a final whisper, and crops returned cautiously to the fields. Peasants in Bavaria once again planted barley with trembling hope, while farmers in Vermont watched the frost retreat from their soil like an enemy in retreat. Though the wheat still failed in places and hunger did not vanish overnight, there was something different now, something softer in the wind, something less cruel in the sun, and alongside this reluctant return of the seasons came something else. A subtle yet undeniable shift in how humanity viewed the world around it. The trauma of the vanished summer did not vanish with it. Rather, it planted seeds, quietly, often unnoticed, that would grow across decades. The first signs emerged in the most basic elements of daily survival. Villages that had once taken their harvests for granted began to speak, in low tones, of granaries and food storage. Some townships in Germany and France began setting aside portions of grain, even in good years, as a kind of insurance against the unknowable sky. Local councils discussed contingency plans, not yet using words like disaster relief or food security, but inventing in their own way the earliest outlines of those concepts. In rural England, church parishes held community meetings about collective grain bins, sparking small but notable changes in how food was stored and shared. These were humble beginnings, but they marked the first cautious steps towards systems designed to outlast the winds of weather. In North America, the Great Migration that had begun in desperation now transformed into something more permanent. Families that had fled the icy grips of New England did not all return to their former farms. Many settled further west, where the soil had not frozen in July, and where the promise of land still shimmered, if faintly. The fertile plains of the Ohio River Valley became dotted with homesteads. New communities formed not through conquest, but through climate flight. The migration catalyzed by the cold would go on to shape the demographic map of the United States for generations, placing roots in regions that had once been only sparsely inhabited. Some scholars, in years to come, would refer to the Tambora diaspora, a subtle but significant reshaping of settlement patterns caused not by war, but by ash drifting silently through the stratosphere. Meanwhile, in drawing rooms and academies, a different kind of change began to stir, one of thought and theory. Though science was still young, and the word meteorology was barely known outside small circles, the events of 1816 had left an impression on those with minds tuned to pattern and cause. A handful of scientists and thinkers, intrigued by the strange global dimming, began to search for answers. Without satellite data or computer models, they relied instead on letters, ship logs, almanacs, and keen observation. They noticed something curious. Strange sunsets and temperature drops had also been recorded in Java and Bengal the year before the cold, and more interesting still, there had been an eruption. Mount Tambora, they learned, had exploded with unimaginable force in 1815. It would take decades, and eventually the invention of ice core drilling and global temperature mapping, to fully confirm the connection. But here, in the slow gathering of handwritten observations, the earliest bones of climate science were forming. Artists and writers, too, carried the memory of the lost summer with them. Painters had been mesmerized by the glowing blood-orange skies of 1816, unknowingly capturing volcanic aerosols in oils and watercolors. The distinctive light, soft, eerie, filtered through unseen ash, appeared in the skies of J.M.W. Turner's later canvases, preserved like fossilized sunlight. Writers, particularly those touched by the Gothic winds of Lake Geneva, carried their memories deeper. While Mary Shelley's Frankenstein would outlive its era, but behind the horror and electricity, readers have long detected something colder, a world where nature is not kind, and warmth is not guaranteed. That feeling, born in a storm-darkened Swiss villa, echoed far beyond literature. It became a sensibility, a recognition, a mood. In policy circles, though the gears of governance turned more slowly, the echoes of 1816 could not be completely ignored. Politicians who had once dismissed the food riots as passing troubles now faced a new kind of question: what is the responsibility of a state in the face of natural catastrophe? Though large-scale governmental relief was rare and inconsistent, the idea had been born that intervention, however small, might soften the blow of weather's wrath. In Prussia, administrators began to track grain surpluses more carefully. In France, discussions began about tariffs on imported food. The beginnings were clumsy, and often driven by fear of rebellion rather than altruism, but even these pragmatic shifts laid groundwork for future reforms in disaster response and food policy. The crisis had forced an uncomfortable truth to the surface, that human systems were in fact fragile, and that nature could humble empires in a single season. And yet, perhaps the most lasting change was quieter still. It resided not in fields or laws, but in the minds of ordinary people, the way they began to see the world. The dependable rhythm of the seasons had faltered. Summer had betrayed them. The sun itself had become untrustworthy. That dissonance lodged itself in memory. Even as warmth returned and harvests filled barns once more, many carried with them a new kind of humility, a knowledge that the sky could change, and that the world was more interconnected than it appeared. The idea that a volcano half a world away could freeze potatoes in Nova Scotia was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. It hinted at a world that was bigger, more dynamic, and more delicate than they had imagined. In time, new generations would forget the chill pulse. They would speak of 1816 as legend, as a curious tale their grandparents told. But the seeds remained. In barns built larger, in grain stored longer, in towns founded further west, and in the books and paintings that remembered the cold even after it had passed. The year without a summer had come and gone, but from its ash and silence, a new world had slowly begun to take root.